Alright everybody, how are we doing today? So talking about Canada has made me feel a little homesick. Time to talk about our own country, huh? So from Reason, Free Minds and Free Markets, Elizabeth Warren is running out of fake money to pay for her terrible ideas. Elizabeth Warren has finally finished spending all the fake money she intends to raise from her wealth tax. A policy that is unlikely to be enacted and where it's somehow to become law would almost certainly raise substantially less money than she claims. The latest idea that Warren wants to finance with her wealth tax is an $800 billion plan to spend more on public schools, which includes grants for schools with low income and disabled students, as well as $50 billion for school infrastructure. The plan follows a $1.5 trillion plan to make public college tuition free and cancel a substantial amount of student debt, as well as a $700 billion plan to fund childcare. Warren previously wanted to pay for a $100 billion opioid plan, a $7 billion small business fund, and a $20 billion election security plan with the tax as well. She now says they will be paid for with additional taxation of inheritance. She's not even the Democratic nominee, much less president, and already she's exhausting her supply of imaginary tax revenue. Still searching for that magic money tree, I see. Altogether, the three education and child care focused plans would cost about $2.75 trillion over a decade, precisely the amount that she says her wealth tax would raise. That alone would raise suspicions, but in Warren's telling, it all adds up perfectly, and in recent days, she has explicitly defended the tax on the grounds that the revenue math is solid. Do the math, it clearly is enough. We have made very conservative estimates on the revenue. I have consulted with tax experts about it, with economists about it. And the money is there, she said at a campaign rally yesterday. You know what happened to Sweden in the 1970s? They instituted a wealth tax. You know why their GDP dropped to near zero? Because in order to dodge the wealth tax, the wealthy just moved their money into offshore bank accounts or simply left the country. Funny how that works. There are legal ways to avoid taxation. So, Lizzie, here's the thing. What's to prevent the rich from dodging your tax by just doing that? Crickets. You can just hear the crickets. No, seriously, these people, these liberals, the Democrats, they don't understand economics. I swear to God, if they even touched a book on basic economics, their hand would literally catch fire. Okay? So, going on, maybe it isn't since Warren first proposed her wealth tax, it has come under intense scrutiny for being unworkable, unpassable, and unrealistic in its revenue projections. The first problem with using a wealth tax to finance Warren's plan is political, even with unified Democratic control of Congress. An unlikely proposition. It's hard to imagine that a wealth tax would actually pass. The second problem is practical. It is quite difficult to calculate wealth, especially for the richest households, which tend to have obscure assets, as well as the resources to shield their fortunes from evaluation. Indeed, capital flight is one of the reasons why the large majority of developed economies that have adopted wealth taxes have also abandoned them. In a survey of economic experts conducted by Chicago Booth earlier this year, for example, 73% agreed Warren's wealth tax would be much more difficult to enforce than existing federal taxes, thanks to complications arising from valuation and tax evasion. Meanwhile, Warren's insistence that the math adds up ignores the very real academic debates over the sources of her estimates. One study presented at the National Bureau of Economic Research this summer, for example, found that Warren's numbers vastly overestimate the amount of wealth that would be available to tax, suggesting that it would raise far less revenue than what she projects. Warren's underlying estimates come from Emmanuel Says, a Gabriel Zuckman, two economists at the University of California, Berkeley, who for much of this year have been engaged in an extended argument with former Obama administration economic advisor Larry Summers, who has emerged as one of the more vocal critics of their work. Just because you're an economist doesn't mean you actually know what you're doing. There's applying an idea on paper in the form of theory, and there's applying it in practical in the form of legislation. And they are two very different animals. So simply because you're an economist doesn't mean that you actually know what you're doing. That requires life experience, not education. Those, again, are two very different things. Let's keep going before I start rambling. Summers has argued that Sayes and Zuckman wildly underestimate tax avoidance, which would substantially reduce the amount of revenue a wealth tax would raise. In a June piece for the Washington Post, Summers strongly suggested that their optimistic estimates are both out of line with mainstream economics and influenced by political bias. Gee, nah! Readers may find it difficult to evaluate the technical aspects of this debate, but they should keep in mind that Sayes and Zuckman are writing in a commissioned letter to a presidential candidate for a campaign proposal. Meanwhile, experts with experience in tax policy, scorekeeping, and academics on the progressive end of the political spectrum, such as ourselves and MIT economist Jonathan Gruber, are much more pessimistic on the revenue-raising potential of wealth taxation in this context. Sayes and Zuckman's indignant insistence that their $187 billion annual revenue estimate number is not a best-case scenario, but instead a middle-ground estimate seems unsound. More recently, Summers attacked Sayes and Zuckman for a piece in which they claimed that billionaires are now paying a lower tax rate than the middle class, an argument that has been used to justify a wealth tax at a panel last week. Summers says he is almost entirely persuaded that their data is substantially inaccurate and substantially misleading. The point is this: Warren has framed her wealth tax as a mathematical certainty, the kind of easy and obvious policy that no one could reasonably quarrel with on substance. Yet credible mainstream economists have been quarreling with it for months, offering strong evidence that her estimates are technically flawed in ways that just happen to be politically convenient for her campaign. Yeah, go figure. These economists who have been giving her quotes, they're just as politically biased as she is. They're probably liberals. They're probably Democrats. And they just want what they want. Their emotions are overriding their reason and their better judgment. Emotions have a way of doing that. To finish this one off, this has been Elizabeth Warren's approach to politics and policy for years. Introduce a heavy-handed policy based on dubious data, then argue that no other arguments or interpretations have any ground to stand on. Her response to dissent is to deny its legitimacy or pretend it simply doesn't exist. Do the math, she says. It is clearly enough. Yet despite that, Warren would have you believe others have done the math, and they have found that it is far from clear, and that it's enough. The historical precedent is there. The economic theory is there. The substance is there. Her wealth tax would be a nightmare. It could potentially kill our GDP growth. It could harm this country massively. And yet she still wants to do it because she's blinded by her emotional attachment to these crazy socialist policies. And that's what the left really is at the end of the day. Liberals and leftists in general are fueled by emotion. They're illogical, and their better judgment is being overridden by their feelings. They're not going for what they know they can have. They're going for what they want. That's a dangerous thing. Emotions can mislead. They're a bad basis to make decisions on. I treat my emotions as like an informational gathering device. They're sort of like, I guess you could just say I use them in the sense that they're more of an intuition. But in order to get actual substance, you need logic. Feelings only give you a general understanding of what's going on around you. To get more specific and more substantial information, you need logic. And the left basically has none. Anyway, peace!